There is a question that sits at the heart of the First World War's literary legacy, and it is one that most accounts of the conflict prefer to sidestep. It is not comfortable, it does not fit the dominant narrative of mud and futility, of doomed youth and criminal commanders, of industrial slaughter stripped of all meaning. The question is this: why did some men, educated men, thoughtful men, men who had seen their comrades disemboweled and their positions reduced to charnel fields, describe the war not merely as something they survived, but as the defining experience of their lives? Why did certain veterans speak not only of horror, but of joy? Not only of waste, but of revelation? Not only of death, but of a peculiar clarifying vitality? This is not a marginal or eccentric phenomenon. It runs through the war's literature with surprising consistency, surfacing in the letters of young British officers before the Somme, in the manifestos of Italian intellectuals who celebrated bombardment as aesthetic experience, in the memoirs of French soldiers who confessed to exhilaration even as they mourned the dead, and most persistently, most intellectually rigorously, in the work of one German soldier who would go on to become one of the most controversial writers of the 20th century. His name was Ernst Jünger. He was born in Heidelberg on the 29th of March 1895, the son of a successful pharmacist and chemist. He grew up in comfortable bourgeois circumstances, attended various schools with unremarkable academic distinction, and displayed from an early age the qualities that would define his later thought: a ferocious curiosity, a restlessness with the ordinary, and an appetite for experience that exceeded anything conventional German middle-class life could satisfy. At 17, he ran away briefly to join the French Foreign Legion, reaching Africa before being retrieved by his father. It was an episode that revealed the essential Jünger, a man who did not merely read about intensity, but sought it out. When war came in August 1914, Jünger was 19 years old. He volunteered immediately. He joined the 73rd Hanoverian Fusiliers and was sent to the front with the methodical efficiency of an imperial army that believed the conflict would conclude within months. It did not conclude. Instead, it expanded into something that no European civilization had previously produced: a war of industrial scale fought by mass conscript armies, a war in which the machine gun, the heavy artillery piece, and the barbed wire entanglement reduced human courage to a matter of statistical probability. Where to advance was to die, and to retreat was to die, and to remain in place was simply to wait for the arithmetic to complete itself. Jünger fought in this war for 4 years. He served at the Somme, at Arras, at Langemarck, at Cambrai, and at a dozen lesser engagements. He was wounded 14 times. He rose to the rank of lieutenant and then lieutenant captain, commanding stormtrooper units in the increasingly sophisticated infiltration tactics that Germany developed in the war's final years. On the 22nd of September 1918, he was awarded the Pour le Mérite, the highest military decoration available to a German officer, the Blue Max, becoming one of the youngest men ever to receive it. 6 weeks later, the war ended. Then he did something that would make him famous, celebrated, and widely reviled in roughly equal measure for the rest of the century. He wrote about it honestly. A Storm of Steel, first published in 1920, is not a book that fits any of the established categories that subsequent decades assigned to First World War literature. It does not belong to the tradition of Wilfred Owen or Siegfried Sassoon, whose magnificent anti-war verse identified the conflict as a crime perpetrated by old men upon young ones. It does not belong to the tradition of Henri Barbusse, whose Under Fire presented trench warfare as class-inflected suffering that demanded socialist revolution. It does not belong to Erich Maria Remarque's All Quiet on the Western Front, which achieved vast popularity precisely because it confirmed what most of Europe needed to believe: that the soldiers themselves had been unwilling victims, that no one who experienced the trenches had found anything there except misery. Jünger's book did not deny misery. It was unflinching about death, about mutilation, about the physical realities of a war fought in close quarters, with machine guns and hand grenades and flame projectors. But it also described something else. It described excitement. It described the strange, disquieting pleasure of combat. It described moments of what can only be called ecstasy in the technical sense of the word, a standing outside oneself, a dissolution of ordinary psychological boundaries, an encounter with an extreme of experience that was, paradoxically, also an encounter with something essential and clarifying about existence. This is the Jünger problem, and it is worth taking seriously, not because he was right, that is a question we will return to, but because his experience was not entirely unique, and because understanding why war could feel the way he described it feeling requires us to think carefully about what the war actually was and what it did to the men who lived inside it. In the preface to an early edition of Storm of Steel, Jünger wrote with characteristic directness that he intended to present the war neither as adventure nor as horror, but as the thing it was. That formulation sounds almost clinical, but the book that follows it is anything but. It is a record of sustained intensity, and the intensity is described with a precision that makes it all the more unsettling. Because Jünger was not a sensationalist, and he did not reach for shock. He simply recorded what he observed, including what he observed in himself. Consider his description of an artillery bombardment, the experience that defined trench warfare more than any other, and that most veterans described with unqualified horror. Jünger described something more complicated. He wrote of the way the ground shook, of the air filled with hot metal and displaced earth, of men throwing themselves into shell craters and pressing their bodies against the mud, as though trying to dissolve into it. And he also described the way this experience concentrated attention to a degree that ordinary life never achieved. Every second had weight. Every perception was precise. The mind, stripped of everything peripheral, arrived at something fundamental. He wrote in Storm of Steel of the experience before an attack. We had grown up in a material world, and suddenly we were plunged into a situation where the animal was suddenly dominant over the cultural being. He described the transformation that occurred when men who had been clerks and students and shopkeepers were asked to advance across open ground under fire. Something happened to them. Something was revealed or unlocked. Whether this was admirable or simply a biological response to mortal danger was a question Jünger considered at length, but he did not pretend it was not real. His description of close combat, of fighting at the level of individuals rather than armies, is particularly striking. In the stormtrooper actions that Jünger specialized in, men crossed the wire at night with grenades and entrenching tools and short-bladed weapons, descending into enemy trenches before dawn could expose them. This was combat in its most ancient and visceral form, stripped of the long distances that artillery introduced between killer and killed. Jünger described these actions with the calm of an entomologist. He described the precise mechanics of entering a trench, the decision-making that occurred in fractions of seconds, the way the body moved on pure instinct, while some observing faculty watched from a slight remove with something approaching detachment. He wrote, "A great rage seized me, and I struck at the approaching shapes, hurling my steel against the dark." The passage is characteristic, precise, physical, without theatrical decoration, and also, disturbingly, charged with something that is not quite grief and not quite pride, but partakes of both. It is the record of a man in the full flood of violent action, and what makes Jünger's account remarkable is that he does not apologize for the fact that it felt, in that moment, like being entirely alive. This is the phenomenon he returned to again and again, from different angles across several decades of writing. War, as he experienced it, was not simply an intensification of ordinary experience, it was qualitatively different. The categories that governed civilian existence, security, comfort, social position, ambition, the management of small anxieties dissolved completely. What remained was something older, and in Jünger's view, more essential. He was not merely describing adrenaline, though adrenaline was certainly part of it. He was describing what happened when a human being was placed in conditions of genuine extremity and discovered that the extremity did not, in itself, destroy them. The discovery was, he believed, informative. It told you something about yourself and about the human animal, more generally, that could not be learned any other way. The concept of the steel tempest, the Stahlgewitter, runs through Storm of Steel as both a literal description of artillery bombardment and a metaphor for what the war itself was doing. Jünger was not the first to use the image, but he made it his own in a way that tells us a great deal about his sensibility. A tempest is not simply destructive, it is also purifying, clarifying, an event that removes everything fragile and leaves what endures. To live through the Stahlgewitter and emerge on the other side was, in Jünger's accounts, to have been tested by something absolute. Whether the test was worth taking was a different question, and Jünger largely declined to answer it in those terms. He was describing an experience, not recommending a policy. He wrote of the clarity that descended before an assault, the way fear transformed into something harder and more useful, the way the body prepared itself with a physiological thoroughness that no act of will could have produced. He described watching men whom he had seen frightened in training become, under fire, something else, collected, precise, indifferent to danger, in a way that seemed almost supernatural and was, he argued, entirely natural. War, in this view, was not contrary to human nature. It was an expression of it, and a particularly unfiltered one. "We had grown to be a single being," he wrote of his company, fused in the fire of the front. "The image is deliberately alchemical. Fire transforms, it does not simply destroy. The men who came out of the trenches were not the men who went in, and for Jünger this transformation was not only loss. Something had been added, even as much had been taken away." But to understand what Jünger was arguing, it is necessary to understand what he thought the war had been replacing. His later work, particularly the philosophical essay on pain, published in 1934, and the more ambitious Der Arbeiter, The Worker, published in 1932, provides the conceptual framework that Storm of Steel implies without fully articulating. Jünger's diagnosis of the world that produced the First World War was, in essence, a diagnosis of bourgeois civilization. He saw the 19th century as having created a form of human existence defined by comfort, security, and the systematic elimination of risk. The Industrial Revolution had produced material abundance and had also, in Jünger's view, produced a psychological softness, an existence so padded against contingency that the human being living within it had become disconnected from the elemental realities that had shaped the species over millennia. The bourgeois world was a world of insurance policies and indoor heating and daily newspapers, of careers and social anxieties and the gradual accumulation of small domestic securities. It was, Jünger argued, a world from which genuine experience had been almost entirely expelled. War ended this. War was, in the most literal possible sense, the removal of all padding. When a man lay in a shell hole under a barrage, with dead men on either side of him, and the next minute genuinely uncertain, the insurance policy and the career prospects and the social anxieties were exposed as the thin constructions they always had been. Death was not a statistical possibility to be managed. It was a physical presence perhaps 15 seconds away. And this, Jünger argued, was not simply terrible. It was also, in a precise and technical sense, clarifying. He was careful to insist that this did not mean the war was good, or that death was desirable, or that suffering served some higher purpose in any theological sense. He was making a more limited and, he believed, more honest claim that the confrontation with mortality, when it was genuine and immediate, produced a kind of knowledge that could not be obtained otherwise. The men who had been through the trenches knew something that men who had not been through them did not know, and this knowledge was not simply knowledge of horror, it was knowledge of themselves. In On Pain, he explored this with philosophical rigour. Pain, he argued, was not simply a negative sensation to be eliminated or avoided, it was information. It was the body's most direct communication with reality, a signal that stripped away abstraction and demanded absolute attention. The capacity to endure pain, to remain functional within it, and even to act effectively through it, was, Jünger believed, one of the fundamental metrics of human character, and the front had provided this test in conditions of almost incomprehensible intensity. He wrote that the true soldier was not someone who had conquered fear, because fear was a reasonable response to danger, and to claim its elimination was simply to lie. The true soldier was someone who had learned to act in the presence of fear, to carry it as a burden that did not stop movement. This was a different claim than the romantic idea of the fearless warrior, and it was more interesting precisely because it acknowledged the reality of what was being overcome. The concept of the new man that emerges in Jünger's interwar writing is complex and has been simplified and distorted by subsequent readings, particularly by those who have attempted to place him within a fascist intellectual tradition. His new man, the warrior figure forged by industrial combat, was not primarily a political category. It was a psychological one. It was his attempt to describe what the trenches had actually produced, a type of human being who had been formed by conditions of extreme industrial violence and had, through that formation, acquired qualities that Jünger regarded as both distinctive and significant. Discipline, endurance, a particular relationship to danger, a capacity to act under conditions that would paralyze ordinary psychology. He wrote in Storm of Steel of his stormtroopers, "This is the new man, the pioneers of the storm, the elite of Central Europe, a completely new race, cunning, strong, and filled with will." The passage has been quoted endlessly, usually by those who wish to present Jünger as a proto-fascist, and it is true that the language is grandiose, and that the concept of racial hierarchy it implies is profoundly problematic. But read in context and read alongside Junger's more careful philosophical works, the claim he was making was primarily anthropological rather than political. He had watched men do things under fire that seemed to exceed the ordinary bounds of human capacity, and he was trying to account for it. His accounting was flawed, selective, and coloured by the aesthetic preferences of a particular German intellectual tradition. But it was not, at its core, a lie about what he had observed. Junger was not alone in finding this vocabulary for the war. His experience, or at least his mode of processing it, was shared with variations by a significant number of European intellectuals who either fought in the war or observed it closely. To examine these parallel responses is not to validate Junger's philosophy, but to understand that he was giving voice to something that ran more broadly through European culture than is often acknowledged. The Italian futurist movement provides perhaps the most extreme and the most unguarded expression of the aestheticization of violence. Filippo Tommaso Marinetti, the movement's founder and chief theorist, had declared in his 1909 Futurist Manifesto that war was the world's only hygiene. The phrase is grotesque in retrospect and was, in truth, deeply irresponsible even in its own time. Marinetti was not interested in the reality of warfare. He was interested in its aesthetic and symbolic potential. Speed, violence, technology, the destruction of the old, these were the categories of futurist thought, and war was their supreme expression. The actual experience of combat was, for Marinetti, almost incidental. He participated in the Italo-Turkish War of 1911 as a reporter, filed dispatches that celebrated bombardment as sonic art, and returned to Italy convinced that he had witnessed the future. The Great War disconfirmed much of this. The futurists who actually fought in it, and several did, including the sculptor Umberto Boccioni, who died in 1916 from injuries sustained in a cavalry exercise, encountered something considerably more complicated than the clean mechanical aesthetics their manifestos had promised. The trenches were not a futurist painting. They were wet and cold and infested with lice, and filled with men dying slowly from gas wounds and infected wounds and the slow-motion torment of artillery fire that never seemed to stop. Yet even here, a residue of the futurist sensibility persisted. The observation that industrial war had a terrible beauty, that a barrage at night was visually extraordinary, that the machines of destruction were considered purely as machines, astonishing objects. Junger made similar observations with greater intellectual honesty because he was not in the business of propaganda. He was capable of writing in Storm of Steel that the sight of a massed bombardment was aesthetically overwhelming, a spectacle of terrible grandeur, while also recording in the same pages what happened to the men caught within it. He held both perceptions simultaneously. He did not use one to cancel the other. Pierre Drieux La Rochelle, the French novelist and later collaborator who fought at Charleroi in 1914, provides a different and in some ways more disturbing version of this experience. Drieux was not a systematic philosopher like Junger. He was a novelist of considerable gifts and a man of volatile, self-lacerating temperament who spent his life oscillating between brilliant observation and catastrophic political judgment. In La Comédie de Charleroi, written in 1934, he described a young officer's experience at Charleroi in the war's opening weeks, the bewilderment of modern combat, the chaos, the sudden deaths that made no sense within any coherent narrative. But he also described something else, a feeling of being, for the first time, completely present. He wrote of the charge at Charleroi as the only moment in his life when he had not been performing himself for an audience, when the ordinary theatre of social existence had been stripped away and replaced by something raw and immediate. This is a recurring theme in the accounts of those who found something valuable in their war experience. It is not the violence itself that they valued in most cases, or if they were honest, they were troubled by their valuation of the violence. What they valued was the quality of presence that the violence enforced. In combat, there was no possibility of distraction. There was no possibility of worrying about tomorrow's social engagement or yesterday's professional failure. There was only the immediate, the ground, the light, the sounds of approaching fire, the position of the man beside you. This quality of enforced presence, Junger and others argued, was something that civilian existence made almost impossible to achieve, and that war, for all its cost, provided in abundance. Ernst von Salomon, a younger German of the same generation who did not fight in the Great War itself, but participated extensively in the post-war Freikorps actions in the Baltic and in Germany, articulated in his memoir, The Outlaws, a version of this experience that was more nakedly political than Junger's, but shared many of its psychological roots. Von Salomon and his generation had been formed by a war they had been too young to fight in and unmade by a peace they had never chosen. For them, the Freikorps represented an attempt to continue, or at least to approximate, the intensity that the trenches had provided to the generation immediately before them. The Outlaws is a morally troubling book in many respects, but as a psychological document of what the war's aftermath produced in certain young men, it is illuminating. The violence it describes was not random or purposeless, at least in the psychological economy of those who committed it. It was an attempt to sustain a mode of existence that the peace had abolished. It is important, however, to draw a clear distinction between the early enthusiasm of 1914 and the sustained frontline experience that produced Junger's more complex and more philosophically serious engagement with violence. These were not the same phenomenon, and treating them as continuous misrepresents both. Rupert Brooke, the gifted English poet who died in 1915 on his way to Gallipoli without having seen serious combat, represents the former, with characteristic elegance and characteristic innocence. His famous sonnet sequence of 1914, with its opening line, "Now God be thanked who has matched us with his hour," expressed the idealism of a generation that had no real knowledge of what they were entering. Brooke's war poems are beautiful and entirely wrong not as dishonest expressions of feeling, but as predictions of what the war would actually be. They expressed a genuine cultural mood, the sense, widely shared in August 1914 across all the belligerent nations, that the war represented an opportunity for renewal, for the testing of national character, for the replacement of a stifling, peacetime tedium with something more vivid and significant. This mood did not survive the Somme. By the end of 1916, the men who had enlisted with Brooke's optimism largely shared the disillusioned realism of Siegfried Sassoon, who had also enlisted with enthusiasm and who had genuinely distinguished himself in combat, earning a military cross before arriving at the conclusion that the war was a crime. Sassoon's trajectory from eager volunteer to author of the Soldier's Declaration of 1917, in which he publicly refused to return to the front as a protest against the conduct of the war, represents one authentic response to sustained combat experience. Junger's trajectory from eager volunteer to philosopher of the Steel Tempest represents another, and the difference between them is not simply one of national culture or individual temperament, though those played a role. It is also a difference in the fundamental question each man was asking. Sassoon was asking, is this war worth the dying? His answer was no, and his grounds were primarily ethical and political. The war could be ended, he believed, by negotiation, and the reason it was not being ended was the stubbornness or incompetence or callousness of those directing it. Junger was asking a different question. He was not asking whether the war was justified, he was asking what it revealed about human existence that less extreme conditions concealed. These are not competing answers to the same question. They are answers to entirely different questions, and the frequent conflation of them has produced a good deal of confusion in discussions of Great War literature. Henri Barbuse's Under Fire, which won the Prix Goncourt in 1916 and was read widely across Europe as an authentic soldier's account, represents perhaps the most systematic counterstatement to the Jungerian position. Barbuse fought in the trenches and wrote about them with genuine authority, but his framework was socialist and humanist, and his conclusion was essentially opposite to Junger's. Where Junger saw the frontline soldier as a new archetype, forged and clarified by industrial violence, Barbuse saw victims, men whose suffering exposed the injustice of the social order that had produced the war, and that would, he believed, have to be transformed before such suffering could end. The soldiers in Under Fire are not warriors, they are workers, conscripted into a conflict that served interests not their own, enduring conditions that no human being should be asked to endure. Both accounts were honest, both were based on genuine experience. Their incompatibility is not the result of one author lying and the other telling the truth. It is the result of two authentic responses to extreme experience by men with fundamentally different philosophical and political frameworks for making sense of it. The question of why combat could feel pleasurable, or more precisely why the state of existence produced by sustained combat under lethal conditions could feel more vivid and significant than ordinary life, is one that subsequent psychology has approached from several directions, but it is important to frame this question historically, as it would have been understood by the men who experienced it rather than importing the vocabulary of modern neuroscience onto a context that did not possess it. The men of 1914 to 1918 did not have the language of adrenaline and cortisol and neurological arousal. They were not equipped with theories of post-traumatic stress disorder or the limbic system's response to mortal threat. What they had was direct experience, a pre-existing cultural vocabulary for making sense of it, drawn from classical tradition, from romantic philosophy, from the martial literature of their respective nations, and from whatever religious or metaphysical frameworks they had been raised within. Jünger drew primarily on Nietzsche, though he was a more careful and more historically grounded reader of Nietzsche than most of his contemporaries. The Nietzschean idea that genuine existence required the confrontation with danger and difficulty, that the comfortable life was a diminished life, that suffering endured voluntarily and purposefully was qualitatively different from suffering merely inflicted. These concepts provided Jünger with a ready framework for interpreting what he was living through. Whether they constituted an adequate framework is a separate question. What the psychology of combat actually involved, stripped of philosophical overlay, was something like this. The human organism in conditions of mortal danger undergoes a profound physiological transformation. The attentional systems narrow and sharpen, peripheral concerns are suppressed, the perception of time alters, typically slowing in a way that makes each moment feel expanded. The social inhibitions that govern ordinary behavior are suspended, and the body's capacity for physical action is, for a period, substantially enhanced. These are not metaphysical phenomena, they are biological adaptations to predation that the species has carried for a very long time. But there is a psychological dimension that goes beyond straightforward fight-or-flight response. Group cohesion under threat is, evolutionarily speaking, one of the most powerful forces in human social psychology. Men who depend on each other for survival develop attachments that civilian life rarely produces, and these attachments have a quality of intensity that is felt by those who experience them as something close to love. The literature of the First World War is permeated by this, by accounts of the bond between soldiers that exceeded in immediacy and depth most other relationships in their lives. This was not unique to soldiers who found combat exhilarating. It was felt as acutely by those who found it simply horrifying, but it contributed to the general quality of frontline existence that made some veterans describe the trenches not only with repulsion, but with a kind of terrible nostalgia. Jünger wrote of his company with exactly this quality. He did not sentimentalize them, his prose style was constitutionally incapable of sentimentality, but he recorded the fact of their significance to him with a precision that makes clear he was not speaking of mere professional collegiality. These were men with whom he had shared the only conditions that seemed to him genuinely real. They had been exposed together to an extreme that nothing in civilian life approached. The bond produced by that exposure was, in his experience, unlike anything else. There is also the question of what the trenches offered that civilian life explicitly withheld: clarity of purpose. This sounds paradoxical in relation to a war whose political justifications became increasingly obscure as it progressed, and the irony was not lost on the men living through it. But at the level of individual experience, the front provided something that peacetime rarely did: a completely unambiguous hierarchy of priorities. Survival was first, the survival of the men beside you was equal or greater, everything else was secondary. The social complexity of civilian life, its overlapping obligations, its ambiguous demands, its requirement for constant performance before multiple and sometimes incompatible audiences was entirely abolished. This abolition was, for some men, experienced as relief. Jünger was explicit about this. He found the transition back to civilian life in 1918 profoundly disorienting, not primarily because of trauma in the clinical sense, though the clinical consequences of what he had experienced were certainly present, but because the world he returned to seemed to him thin and arbitrary compared to the world he had left. The priorities that governed it seemed trivial. The stakes that motivated its inhabitants seemed small. He had spent 4 years in a world where the stakes were always absolute and the priorities were always clear, and nothing in Weimar Germany seemed capable of providing an equivalent intensity. This experience was not unique to Jünger. It was described with varying degrees of explicitness and self-awareness by veterans across all the belligerent nations. The historian Paul Fussell, in his foundational study The Great War and Modern Memory, documented at length the way in which the front produced a separate and internally coherent world that had, for many of its inhabitants, a quality of reality that the world they had come from lacked. The irony he identified, that an experience characterized by industrial violence, systematic dehumanization, and mass death could also feel more real and more significant than ordinary life, is not one that can be resolved by simply insisting that it should not have been the case. It was the case, and understanding why it was the case requires the kind of honest attention that Jünger, for all the philosophical and political problems his work raises, consistently applied. The clarity of the immediate moral structure, enemy or comrade, this direction or that direction, advance or hold, was part of it. But so was something more fundamental, the complete removal of the future as a practical category. In civilian life, the future is the dominant temporal dimension. We plan for it, worry about it, structure our present experience largely in relation to it. In the trenches, the future was genuinely uncertain from one minute to the next, and this uncertainty, paradoxically, concentrated the present in ways that very few people experience in ordinary circumstances. The present moment had a quality and a weight that it lacked when the future was securely available. Jünger described this with characteristic precision. He wrote of moments in combat when the awareness of possible death produced not panic, but a form of absolute attention, a quality of being entirely in the present tense that he found, despite himself, remarkable. He was not celebrating this, he was recording it, and recording it with the honesty that was, for him, the primary intellectual obligation. The horror and the intensity were not separable in his account. This is important. He was not arguing that the pleasure of combat was achieved by ignoring or suppressing its violence. He was arguing that the pleasure and the violence were the same phenomenon experienced from different angles. The thing that made combat terrifying was precisely the thing that made it vivid. The proximity of death concentrated existence. The concentration of existence was what the experience felt like from inside, even as the proximity of death was what it looked like from outside. You could not have one without the other, and any account that excised one in favour of the other was, in Jünger's view, falsifying the record. Jünger's experience at the Somme in 1916 provides perhaps the clearest illustration of this complexity. The Somme is, in the historiography of the First World War, the name most associated with pointless slaughter, specifically the British experience of the 1st of July 1916, when the army suffered nearly 60,000 casualties in a single day, the greatest single-day loss in the history of the British military. But the Somme was not only a British disaster, it was a 5-month campaign that involved French, British and German forces in sustained combat across a stretch of chalk downland and ruined villages that had once been ordinary agricultural landscape, and the German experience of the Somme was as extreme as anything the British underwent. Jünger arrived in the Somme sector in the late summer and autumn of 1916, when the campaign was already several months old, and the landscape had been so thoroughly reworked by artillery that it no longer resembled anything that had existed before the war. He described it in terms that have since become iconic in German war literature. The chalky mud, the collapsed trenches, the craters that merged into each other to form a continuous moonscape, the absence of any organic life in the immediate forward areas. He was not describing this as a setting for heroic action. He was describing annihilation, the reduction of a landscape and a culture to raw material for industrial killing. Within this landscape, Jünger was wounded repeatedly. He was shot. He was hit by shell fragments. He survived experiences that killed the men beside him through the operation of what seemed from inside like pure chance, the arbitrary geometry of trajectory and timing. He recorded these near deaths with a quality of attention that is, in retrospect, clearly the attention of someone in a state of sustained psychological hyperarousal. Each detail was precise, each moment was recorded as though it might be the last moment, because at the time of its occurrence it might well have been. He wrote of one occasion when he was hit in the chest by shrapnel and lay in a shell crater believing he was dying. He described the experience not as terror, though terror was present, but as clarity. He looked at the sky above the crater. He thought of specific things. He was fully present to the experience of dying in a way that nothing in his previous existence had prepared him for, and this quality of presence was, he recorded, remarkable in itself, separate from and alongside the fear and pain that accompanied it. This is not morbid aestheticism, it is an honest account of what extreme experience does to perception, and it corresponds closely to what subsequent research on near-death experiences and extreme physical states has documented in many contexts. When the body and mind believe that death is imminent, the attentional system undergoes a shift that many people describe in terms that overlap with Jünger's, a heightening of perception, a clarity of awareness, a quality of presence that ordinary life does not produce. Whether this is meaningful or whether it is simply a neurological artifact of mortal stress is a question that Jünger would have considered ill-posed. For him, the distinction between the meaningful and the neurologically produced was not one he accepted. The fact that an experience was produced by neurochemistry did not, in his view, reduce its philosophical significance. Everything was produced by something. The question was what it revealed. He survived the Somme, he survived Arras, where he was again wounded. He survived Langemarck and Passchendaele, where the fighting had a character of particular ferocity. He accumulated wounds and decorations with a consistency that was, by any measure, astonishing, not because he was reckless, but because he continued to function effectively in conditions that destroyed most of the men who experienced them. By 1918, he was commanding stormtrooper units in the German offensive operations of the Spring, the last major German effort to win the war, before the American reinforcements tipped the balance irrevocably. He was in the thick of the March offensive, fighting through the old Somme battlefields that he had first encountered 2 years earlier, and he wrote of this experience, of returning to the devastated landscape, of advancing through it under fire, of capturing positions and holding them against counterattack, with the same quality of attention he brought to everything. He was wounded again in the spring offensive. He returned to the front. He received the Pour le Mérite in September 1918. And then the war ended, and with it, the world that had produced him. The aftermath is in some ways the most revealing part of Jünger's story, because it tests the claims that what he found in the war was not mere addiction to danger, but something genuinely philosophical, a mode of knowledge about existence that he could carry beyond the conditions that had produced it. He did not find the transition easy. The Germany he returned to in November 1918 was not the Germany he had left in 1914. The defeat, the revolution, the humiliation of Versailles, the inflation, the political violence, the sense of a world coming apart at its seams, all of this provided a context in which the psychological disorientation of veterans was politically volatile as well as personally painful. Jünger was not the only veteran who found the peacetime world inadequate to the experience he was carrying, and the political consequences of that inadequacy, the resentments it generated, the movements it fed, constitute one of the most important contexts for understanding the interwar period. But Jünger's response to the war's aftermath was characteristically individual. He did not join the Freikorps, at least not in any sustained way. He did not become a street fighter like many of his contemporaries. He wrote, he read voraciously, pursuing the philosophical and scientific interests that had always been present alongside the warrior temperament. He worked on Storm of Steel with the methodical intensity that he brought to everything, and he published it in 1920 at his own expense, in a small edition that was initially read primarily by veterans. The book grew in reputation slowly, then rapidly. By the mid-1920s, it had become a significant text in German literary and political culture, celebrated by the nationalist right, condemned by the left, regarded with unease by those who could not easily place it within their existing frameworks. It was praised in particular by men who had been at the front and who felt that the dominant narrative of the war, as pointless, as a crime, as something to be apologized for, falsified their experience. Whatever their political orientation, many veterans recognized in Jünger's prose something that seemed honest about what they had been through. Did he miss the war? The question is simpler to ask than to answer, and Jünger's own answers were characteristically nuanced. He did not speak, at least in his published writings, of missing the war, in the way one might miss a lost friend or a lost home. What he wrote about, repeatedly and with great precision, was the sense that the frontline experience had provided a quality of existence that nothing in peacetime adequately replaced. He did not claim this was desirable, he claimed it was true. In later editions of Storm of Steel, Jünger revised the text several times over his extraordinarily long life. He died in 1998 at the age of 102, and the revisions are themselves informative. The most significant changes involved a tonal adjustment, a softening of what some critics perceived as the earliest edition's most uncomplicated glorification of combat. But he never altered the fundamental claim that the front had been a formative experience of the First Order, one that had revealed rather than concealed essential truths about human existence. He was, to the end of his life, unwilling to perform the retrospective repudiation that many readers felt the historical record demanded. This refusal was not, as it is sometimes characterized, the stubbornness of a man too committed to his youthful positions to update them. It was the consistency of a man who had thought carefully about his experience and had arrived at conclusions that he believed were honest, even where they were uncomfortable. He acknowledged the horror, he acknowledged the waste, he acknowledged that millions of men had suffered and died for objectives that history had not vindicated. But he refused to concede that the frontline experience was simply and entirely a negative phenomenon, something that should have produced only revulsion, that revealed nothing of value, that was best dealt with by forgetting it as thoroughly as possible. He was, in this, swimming against a current that grew stronger with every decade. The dominant cultural memory of the First World War in Western Europe converged by the middle of the 20th century on an interpretation that emphasized futility and waste, that lionized the poets of disillusionment and largely ignored the veterans who did not fit this narrative, and that treated any acknowledgement of complexity, any suggestion that the experience had contained within it something other than pure horror, as morally suspect or aesthetically naive. Junger's insistence on complexity was read in this context as endorsement of violence. It was not endorsement, it was refusal to simplify. The moral problem that Junger poses is not, at its core, the problem of a man who celebrated violence. It is the deeper and more uncomfortable problem of what it means that violence, the most extreme and most costly form of human experience, could feel to certain men of genuine intelligence and genuine moral seriousness, like the truest and most clarifying encounter with existence they had ever had. This problem does not go away by pointing to the suffering. Junger knew the suffering better than most of those who have subsequently condemned him for not dwelling on it sufficiently. He had been in it for 4 years, he had been wounded 14 times, he had watched men he knew closely and men he had barely spoken to die in front of him in ways that combined violence and randomness in patterns that resisted any attempt at dignified narrative. He had lived through the Somme and Arras and the Spring Offensive of 1918. He was not describing the war from a safe distance or through a romantic haze. He was describing it from inside, and what he found inside it was more complicated than either pure horror or pure heroism. The tension in his work is not a failure of moral imagination, it is a record of genuine tension. The war was, simultaneously and without resolution, a catastrophe of incomprehensible proportions and a source of experiences that, for those who survived them, could not simply be written off. This is uncomfortable. It is supposed to be uncomfortable. And the discomfort is the point. What the war revealed, through Junger's account of it, was something about the relationship between intensity and meaning, specifically the finding that, for many human beings, intensity and meaning are not merely correlated, but partially identical. Meaning, in ordinary civilian life, is typically distributed thinly across a broad range of experience. It is diluted by distraction, qualified by ambiguity, deferred by the future orientation of ordinary social existence. Though the trenches abolished dilution, they abolished distraction, they replaced ambiguity with the absolute clarity of mortal threat, and replaced the deferred future with the absolute immediacy of the present moment. And in doing so, they produced a quality of experience that many of the men who survived it felt, for the rest of their lives, as the standard against which all other experience was measured. This is a philosophical problem, not merely a historical one. It raises the question of whether a life can be fully meaningful without extremity, whether the comfortable existence that modernity has, at enormous expense and effort, constructed for a substantial portion of humanity, is in some fundamental sense too safe to be fully alive. Junger did not answer this question, at least not directly. He posed it through the record of his experience, and he refused to pretend that the record was simpler than it was. Those who find this intolerable are not wrong to find it intolerable. The implication that meaningful existence might require conditions of violence and death is one that decent people ought to resist, and the 20th century's subsequent production of those conditions on an even larger scale than the First World War provides ample grounds for that resistance. And the argument from experience that Junger was making could be and was appropriated for purposes that he did not explicitly intend and that led to catastrophes he did not foresee. But the appropriation of an argument for bad purposes does not automatically invalidate the argument, and the honest engagement with Junger's legacy requires acknowledging that the experience he described was real, that the philosophical problems it raised were genuine, and that dismissing him as a fascist aesthete or a war pornographer, as some critics have effectively done, is a way of avoiding the discomfort he forces upon us. He was a man who found, in the most violent and destructive experience of his civilization, something that felt to him like truth. He spent the rest of his extraordinarily long life trying to understand what that truth was, what it meant, and what implications it had for the world that survived the war. He was not always right. His political judgments, particularly in the 1930s, were seriously flawed, though he never joined the Nazi Party, and his relationship with the Nazi regime was complex and, in the end, critical rather than collaborative. His philosophical framework, centered on the figure of the warrior as a type of heightened human being, was elitist, selective, and implicitly dismissive of the suffering of those who did not fit the type. But these are failures of a particular kind of thought, and they should not be used to discredit the underlying observation that produced the thought. The observation was simply this: that the war had revealed something about human existence that the peace had concealed, and that this revelation, however terrible the conditions in which it was achieved, was not nothing. There is a final consideration that Junger's work raises, and it is the one that may be most difficult to address in the contemporary context: the question of whether what he described can be separated from the specific historical conditions that produced it, and whether it offers anything that the contemporary world can use. The honest answer is probably not, or not directly. The conditions of the Western Front in 1914 to 1918 were not merely extreme, but historically specific. They arose from the collision of 19th century military culture with 20th century industrial technology, producing a form of warfare that was unprecedented, and that, even in subsequent 20th century conflicts, was never precisely replicated. The trench systems of the Western Front, with their combination of static positions and periodic violent eruption, their mixture of waiting and sudden mortality, their enforced proximity to death over sustained periods, these were products of a particular historical moment that has not recurred. The intensity that Junger described was inseparable from those specific conditions. The clarity he found was the clarity of a situation in which the ordinary coordinates of civilian existence had been completely abolished and replaced by a single, stark imperative: survive. The meaning he derived from the experience was derived from those conditions and those conditions alone, and any attempt to manufacture equivalent intensity through lesser means, through extreme sport, through commercial risk-taking, through the various substitutes that consumer culture offers for genuine extremity, is likely to fail, precisely because the substitutes are voluntarily assumed and can be abandoned when they become uncomfortable. This was the conclusion that most of Junger's contemporaries, including those who had shared his initial response to the war, eventually arrived at: that the intensity of the front was real, and that it had revealed something real about human psychological capacity, and also that it was not reproducible by other means and should not be sought through other means because the price it demanded was simply too high. Junger himself lived long enough to understand this, though he was characteristically reluctant to make it explicit. His post-war life was, in many respects, a sustained attempt to find the equivalent of frontline intensity in other domains, in intellectual work, in natural science, in philosophy, in literature. He became, among other things, a significant entomologist, and his writing about insect life carries, at its best, the same quality of intense attention that characterized his war writing. He found ways to be fully present to experience without requiring that experience to be lethal. But he never fully abandoned the claim that the front had been, for those who survived it, a forge of a particular and unreplicable kind. The world that produced the First World War is gone. The stable order of 19th century Europe, with its interlocking monarchies and its imperial certainties and its confident belief in progress, was shattered by the war and never reassembled. What replaced it was a century of violence and upheaval that Junger lived through almost in its entirety, watching from a great and increasingly ironic distance, as the century repeatedly demonstrated that the conditions he had described and the responses to those conditions that he had articulated were not the unique products of 1914 to 1918, but recurrent features of human experience under extreme industrial pressure. He died on the 17th of February 1998, 17 days before his 103rd birthday, in the small town of Wilflingen in Baden-Württemberg, where he had lived for decades. He was, at the time of his death, one of the last surviving veterans of the First World War. He had survived 2 world wars, the Weimar Republic, the Third Reich, the occupation of France, in which he served, controversially, as a staff officer, in Paris, the Cold War, the reunification of Germany, and the entire arc of the 20th century. He had written more than 50 books. He had received the Goethe Prize and the Schiller Memorial Prize. He had been awarded honorary doctorates by multiple universities. He had been interviewed by major figures in European intellectual life and had engaged in his final decades with the same questions that had occupied him since 1918: the nature of experience, the relationship between violence and clarity, the problem of what existence means when the padding is removed. He never recanted. He never claimed that Storm of Steel was wrong. He revised it, refined it, adjusted its tone, but he never withdrew the central claim. The war had been what he said it was. It had felt the way he said it felt. And the fact that it should not have felt that way, that decent human sensibility ought to demand a cleaner and less complicated moral response to industrial slaughter, this was not for Jünger sufficient grounds to falsify the record. The experience Jünger describes cannot be filed away in either of the conventional categories that have grown up around the First World War. It is not the disillusionment narrative, the naive youth destroyed by incompetent generals in a futile cause. It is not the nationalist narrative, the heroic sacrifice for fatherland and honour. It is something more uncomfortable than either, because it is more honest than either. It is the testimony of a man who looked at one of the most violent episodes in human history and found inside its violence something that felt to him like truth. Not the truth that violence is desirable, or that suffering is good, or that the dead died well. None of those things. But the truth that extreme experience, even when the extremity is terrible, strips away the constructions that ordinary life places over the fundamental facts of existence, and in doing so reveals those facts with a clarity that less extreme conditions cannot provide. This is a difficult thing to sit with. It does not comfortably endorse any political position or any practical recommendation about how to live. It offers no consolation and no program. It is simply an observation about what happens to human perception at the extreme, and what that extreme, for better and for worse, makes visible. The men who fought the First World War inhabited a world of extremity for months and years. They came out of it changed. Some were destroyed by the change, some were embittered, some were simply exhausted, and some, a minority, and Jünger was among the most articulate of them, emerged with a kind of dark and complicated knowledge that they could not explain to those who had not shared it, and could not entirely repudiate to those who wished they had never acquired it. He was a difficult witness. He remains one. The war produced many difficult witnesses, but Jünger is perhaps the most difficult because he was the most rigorous, the most unwilling to accept easy comfort, the most insistent on recording what he had actually experienced rather than what he was expected to have experienced, and the most philosophically equipped to articulate the implications of what the recording revealed. Whether those implications constitute wisdom is a question that each reader must answer. What is not in question is that the experience was real, that the response was genuine, and that the testimony deserves to be engaged with honestly rather than dismissed for the discomfort it produces. The dead of the Somme and Arras and Langemarck and Cambrai have no voice. Jünger spoke for himself only, and he knew it. But in speaking for himself with such precision and such persistence over such a long life, he preserved something of what the war actually was, not what it should have been, not what it would have been more convenient for it to have been, but what it was. That is what serious witnesses do, and it is, finally, what he was.